Storytelling for multi-species justice and care. Note the background for this slide, made of thread and colored leaves, and drawing the pelvis of something that looks like a human being, a spine, the lateral appendages, flippers, hands, feet, it's not clear. The ongoing threading up to the butterfly made of colorized leaves, a kind of human and more than human speaking for the living and the dead in the artwork of an extraordinary collage artist, Geraldine Haraway, who made this work while she was in Singapore. In this lecture, we will follow the living and the dead in a series of stories with a butterfly human symbiont named Camille as our guide. Multi-species justice and care is about entangled human beings with all of the world, never human exceptionalism, never human beings alone. But my focus is always situated in life worlds of living and non-living, humans and other beings like microbes, plants, animals, rocks, soils, and more. Justice is not enough. Care is not enough. And both are only a start for learning what my colleague Anna Tsing calls arts for living on a damaged planet. How do we practice justice and care in these times? How do we practice the arts of flourishing together? How do we join in multi-species justice and care? I begin with a land acknowledgement because I'm sitting in my office in the town of Santa Cruz. I'm speaking for my university, the University of California at Santa Cruz. I am on land that is acquired by conquest and has never been ceded by its owners, by its original owners. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Aswaswa-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the central coast of California, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and to heal from historical trauma. I begin with the monarch butterfly, who will be a kind of guiding presence throughout this entire talk, but it's not the monarch of North America or the monarca of Michoacan and Mexico, but it is the Ka'aloki butterfly, in the string figuring of the Dine of the Navajo. It is in the playing of the game of Na'atlo, which could in Spanish be the Cuna de Gatos, or in English, cat's cradle, or in other languages, many things. But cat's cradling or string figuring are not universal. They are located and specific, and yet they connect with each other. In the Dine, in Dine Bekeya, in the Navajo Nation, string figuring is a practice that teaches the children the constellations of the sky. It's a wintertime practice. It's a storying practice that teaches cosmology. Well, I use string figuring or cat's cradle in a kind of fraught, non-innocent entanglement with other kinds of knotting and entangling practices, like those of the Dine, to insist it matters what stories tell stories. It is not all right to make one's own stories the standard for understanding someone else's. Rather, we have to do something much more risk-taking. We have to tell stories that can interrupt each other so that something comes out of it that was not in either story before. Storytelling, knowledge-making, relating, making worlds is a bringing together in a risk-taking way such that something new can happen in the world. It's a kind of encountering. But this encountering is never innocent of power. and attentiveness to the structures of power, the structures of oppression and conquest and subordination, and the conditions of resistance and liberation are crucial to this kind of entangled storytelling that I propose. In the background, you see an amazing painting by the artist Viola Goldenthal in her Cat's Cradle series, which is also in the background of this figure. Tying knots, making worlds, that is storytelling. It happens under the signifier SF, say F in Spanish perhaps, SF, science fiction, string figures, science fact, speculative fabulation, speculative feminism, in French, soin de ficelle, or perhaps most importantly, so far. We are neither at the beginning nor at the end. We are so far with our efforts to knot together patterns which might deserve a future. But when we make patterns together with many tentacles and paws and branches and tendrils and fingers and partners and pass patterns back and forth, we also drop threads. We fail to make patterns, or perhaps a dropped thread allows us to propose a new pattern, a new figure, a speculative fabulation that deserves a future. I learned my storytelling craft from the master of storytelling, Ursula K. Le Guin. She wrote in The Master of Segri, I learned that the story has no beginning and no story has an end, that the story is all muddle, all middle, that the story is never true, but that the lie is indeed a child of silence. Le Guin wrote in 1986 an extraordinary essay called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. It's just prose, lecture, an essay. It's not itself fiction. Rather, it states that the best kinds of stories are not those of the hero crossing matrix space with the best words and the best weapons to kill the prey and bring it back. That the structure of narrative should not take this conventional masculine form, but rather the better stories take the shape of a carrier bag, of a slightly hollowed out shell, of a net bag, a leaf, a gourd, a shell, a net, a bag, a sling, a sack, a bottle, a pot, a box, a container, a holder, a recipient, for collecting up and sharing. That storytelling is about collecting up and then making available, proposing, sharing, making possible. And Le Guin, in my view, is our best theorist of the art of fiction. Another writer whom I think with and learn from is particularly Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote in the 1980s an amazing book, Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza. She also has written books for children, like Amigos de Otro Lado, Friends from the Other Side. My own student in English, a woman from Oaxaca, for whom I am her English teacher. That's not a sentence in either Spanish or English. Never mind. Anyway, she is my student. And together this year, we read chapters from Borderlands, La Frontera. And she also read chapters with her daughter, who asked, am I mestiza? Am I Anglo? Am I Mexican? Am I Mexicana? Am I Latino? Am I Chicano? Who am I? What am I? Am I citizen? Am I migrant? What am I? I am not my mother. I am her daughter. Who am I? Borderlands, La Frontera, a story of the Texas-Mexican border and the California-Mexican border, transmuted into Chicana feminist theory of la mestiza, of the consciousness of the mestiza, la conciencia de la mestiza, la herencia de Coatlique. In Gloria Anzaldúa's hands, we are proposed a way of thinking, a way of going on with each other that is not binary. She says, I am not alone. that which abides, my vigilance, my thousand sleepless serpent eyes blinking in the night, forever open, I am not afraid. The other book in this slide is Cattail Stories by my friend Graciela Trevisan, who was born in Argentina, but lives and writes in San Francisco, lives with her wife, Lisa Rofel, who is my colleague and friend in anthropology. My English learning student and I have also been reading the Cattail Stories, which is a kind of magical realism about the women of a small town in Argentina who together make a pueblo possible, who together compose a town against the forces of the mayor, the church, the masculinizing, against the forces of patriarchy. Another person I think within this talk, in this talk, is Zoe Todd, an amazing young assistant professor at Carleton University, who is herself a Métis scholar and thinker, who draws from Métis legal traditions, in particular for thinking with fish, thinking with water, for proposing worlds where nature and culture are not split, and in the traditions of the people of Canada, whom she's writing about, the worlds of fish, the worlds of water, the worlds of people co-make living and dying well possible. Now, I start with a short list of the trouble that we must stay with. One could make this list infinitely long, but I only have one slide. Refugees and migrants, human and more than human, without refuges and homes. Who could read the news in North America right now between Mexico and the United States, between Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, and los Estados Unidos, and not understand refugees and migrants without refuge and without homes? Racial colonial capitalism, 3 words that cover much. Femicide, sexual violence, and patriarchy. Climate destruction, unequally born. Extractivism, extinctionism, human exceptionalism, still human exceptionalism, as if human beings were the fruit of evolution and at its peak. Splitting of nature and culture. Pandemics of lands, waters, airs, and places. The out-of-place symbiont, the coronavirus, the SARS-V2 virus, this out-of-place symbiont that is now our companion causing pandemic globally, is only one of many ongoing pandemics of the moment. Not all of them are infecting human beings. We live in and are making a pandemic-friendly planet, and it must stop. Symbionts are out of place everywhere. Those who live together, symbionts, are out of place. Reproductive and environmental suffering and injustice. And reproductive and environmental suffering and injustice are linked. We live in pandemic-friendly agriculture and food systems. We are in the midst of corridors disrupted, connections cut, homes split. We are in the midst of war on Earth and its human and non-human peoples. So I follow the monarchs. I track them as my string figure. And look at this word cloud put together by the very interesting anthropologist Colombo González Duarte, who is currently following the monarchs to write an extraordinary book about all of these links in the cloud. This is, of course, shaped like North America, NAFTA, the United States, dreamers, indigenous, ethnography, nature protection, Mexico, decolonial politics, the Mazahua or Llanato people, human animal, multi-species, and so on, with the butterfly at the center. I have been informed by the scholarship of Colombo González, and I will cite some of it a little later in the talk, but now I want you to inhabit her figure that is on her webpage for her courses. It's on the webpage that proposes her pedagogy. A principle for me is always to begin from what we love. Beginning a critique, beginning a proposal from what we hate is always a bad idea, because we will end with nothing but critique. But if we begin from what we love, we can inhabit the violence, we can inhabit the trouble, and somehow find ways of partial healing to nurture what we love. If we don't begin with what we love, we are lost from the beginning. So I begin with some little thing that I personally love. The monarch butterflies who spend the winter in my town, in Santa Cruz, in California. The monarch butterflies of the great Western migration, who interchange a little bit of gene exchange, a little bit of trading partners with the great Eastern migration that goes, that breeds and lives in the summer in Canada and the United States, and then swings down across the transvolcanic belt to overwinter in a few oyamel trees in Michoacan, basically. These are pictures of the overwintering butterflies from which I begin. And I'm going to do this story by retelling the Camille stories, Making Kin for Multispecies Justice and Care. And I do it with the help of a Mariposa sculpture that is currently in the University of British Columbia. It was made in Mexico sometime in the early 20th century. And it is, of course, a hybrid of human and butterfly. Now, somewhere in the early 21st century, many communities all over the earth spontaneously and simultaneously, for the reasons of trying to come to terms with, trying to live with the trouble and address the destruction of living beings on earth, many hundreds, if not thousands, of small communities were formed, both in areas where people already lived, as well as among people who migrated to ruined, damaged areas. These were communities that committed themselves to the healing of damaged areas. They also committed themselves, as part of their work, to a certain kind of reproductive and environmental justice that aimed to rebalance the human weight on the world over a period of about 400 years, to rebalance the numbers of humans and more than humans in a way that perhaps would be more conducive both to human and non-human justice and care. So they required that every new child have at least 3 parents, and that new children born in this way, the pregnant person in the triad, the reproductive freedom of the pregnant person in the triad, was to choose a symbiont for the fetus, and to choose a symbiont from among the animals who would not have a future without the care by the humans in this symbiosis. And that the child who is born in this way as a symbiont would be the first of 5 generations of that sort of symbiont, committed to the care and ongoingness, to the care and survival of those who would not survive without these practices of care. So the first of 5 Camilles was born in 2025, when human numbers on the earth were about 8 billion, and died in 2100 when numbers were only 10 billion. They would have been well over 11 billion had these practices not been instituted. The first Camille was born in the community of New Gauli, which was built on the site of mountaintop coal removal near Gauli, West Virginia, which was immortalized by my friend and colleague Beth Stevens and her wife Annie Sprinkle in Goodbye to Gauli Mountain, which was about the blowing up, the utter destruction of the mountain for coal mining right above her town. New Gauli was instituted there. remembering the white working class miners and the troubles of their lives, remembering the Native Americans that were actively exterminated and expelled from this territory to allow the mining companies and the white working class miners to reside there, remembering the exclusion of Black miners and Black farmers from this area, remembering history so as to make it possible to go forward. The first Camille 1 modeled per-self, per, P-E-R, after Marge Percy's gender-neutral pronoun. Camille 1 modeled per-self after Nausicaa of the Valley of the Winds, Hayao Miyazaki, an amazing anime film in which the destruction of a world and the production of a toxic forest by greedy, militarized, capitalized, patriarchal forces are opposed successfully, not by yet more war, not by fighting the toxic forest, but by learning to live within the toxic forest so as to heal it. This is the Nausicaa of the Valley of the Winds who inspired our Camille. Now, I said Camille is a symbiont put together through the biological operations of sim, yoking, bio, living, genesis, beginnings, sim, bio, genesis, genesis from linking. Now, Camille has inserted into herself as a fetus genes from the monarchs. The monarchs are not modified genetically ever. Only the humans take on the flesh of their symbionts so as to be able to do their job better, so as to be able to taste the air, see differently, perceive the wind and the water differently. The humans bear the genes of their symbionts. So Camille, as Camille grows, shows in vivid ways the coloring of the 5 larval instars of the young monarch, and remembers that the monarch never lived alone, but like the monarch in this slide, on a stem of milkweed, the only plant the young monarchs can eat, is also living with aphids, also eating from the milkweed. That all of living is a consortium, is, as the slide on the right shows, a dialogue in the holobiont, a dialogue in the consortia of living entities who, taken together, makes each of them what they are. Now, the job of Camille, in addition to addressing the toxic agribusiness, the toxic residue of the fossil fuel industries, is also to address the crisis of the wall between California, Arizona, Texas, and Mexico. And here, Camille 1 drew inspiration from Joanne Barker, a Lenape artist, science fiction writer, and scholar, a woman who was my graduate student back in the day, but I'm her student now. And she allowed me to use her art to dramatize Camille 1's work on the border. Now, you all know, you in my audience, you have seen the map, the slide, the part of the slide on your left, I hope, the Sonoran Desert, the Sky Islands, the area of El Paso, Big Bend, and the area of Monterey and McAllen, the area of the lower Rio Grande Valley as the river empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And you know the extraordinary struggles and crises and emergencies, both human and more than human, throughout this border that is not a border, but a patria compartido, an area of living, an area of homelands, as well as migrations and crossings, an area that must be restored for its integrity as homeland, as living and crossing and traveling and abiding and inhabiting together. So look at the far right again, between Monterey and McAllen, and notice the National Butterfly Research Center poster. And remember what you probably already know, namely that the executive director of the National Butterfly Center in Texas last year was subject to months of rape and death threats for her butterfly conservation work at the National Butterfly Center, for her leading opposition to the building of Trump's wall, which was so destructive ecologically and humanly, so destructive of the human and more than human inhabitants and migrants of this homeland, of this patria compartida. She was receiving these rape and death threats in the same months as the murders in Michoacan of the defenders of the Mariposa, of the lands of the monarch. Gomez Gonzalez and Hernandez are both murdered pretty much in the same month. As to the north, Mariana Trevino Wright is subjected to rape and death threats for their struggle for the border. Now, you probably know, actually, maybe you don't. Whoops, wait a minute, sorry about this. Sorry, we will not do that again. You probably know that the monarchs, as they travel from Canada and the United States to Michoacan, travel directly over Monterrey, that they fly directly over Nuevo León, and that they take a turn at Monterrey and they start moving south. They follow the Sierra Madre Oriental to the Transvolcanic Mountains, and then they turn again. And if I am told that if you look up at the sky in Monterrey at the time of the migration of the monarchs, you can see them make the turn to follow the mountains to their winter home. Now, I also briefly look at an area that is not about monarchs, but is also about the wall and the splitting of peoples, and an area in Arizona and Sonora, which has been subject to a great deal of wall building. The Tohono O'odham Nation was split into two in 1854, when the Arizona-Texas border was created by violent conquest and violent confrontation of states. Today, about 2,000 members of the O'odham Nation live in Mexico, and communication between the parts of the people, the parts of the nation, is very important. They have maintained some continuity, some ability to cross for ritual, for visiting family, and for the animals that cross their territory. Where on either side of the Tohono O'odham Nation property, where the wall was built, the animals trying to cross at night to eat, or perhaps breed and have sex, the animals crossing who would normally cross that area through a more permeable fence now run into Trump's wall and pace back and forth across the wall like they were in a zoo, like they were in a cage. They are confused. Cameras are showing these animals pacing, confused, and then funneling to the remaining openings across the Tohono O'odham Nation, funneling through this little constriction that is both for plants, animals, and people, and telling us that the wall, metaphorically and physically, must come down. Camille II is born in 2085, when human numbers have come down to about 9.5 billion. Today, by the way, in 2021, they are not quite 8.5 billion. So in 2085, with the practices of the communities of compost, human numbers are only 9.5 billion. Camille II died 100 years later when human numbers were 8 billion. Now, the job of Camille II, inherited from Camille I, was spent, the life work of Camille II was spent mostly in Michoacan and Mexico, and mostly working with the peoples of that area, the peoples of the avocado plantations, of the butterfly reserves, of the pueblos, of the ciudades, the peoples of that area. Camille II first arrived in Michoacan on El Día de los Muertos, when the monarch butterflies are the souls of the returning ancestors coming to communicate, to visit, to be with their descendants in a night of eating and singing and exchanging, a night of the coming together of the generations of the living and the dead. And I am calling this not symbiogenesis, but symbiogenesis, and a metamorphosis of the people, a metamorphosis like symbiogenesis, but different. And that Camille too learned symbiogenesis from the people on El Dia de los Muertos. Now, shortly after arriving in Michoacán, the women of El Ejército Zapatista de Mujeres en Defensa del Agua took the rather foolish young Camille II in hand and taught her that the problem that was facing the communities of Michoacán, including the butterflies, are the problems of climate change, extraction, exploitation, monocropping, and perhaps above all, water scarcity. You all know in my audience about trans-basin water transfer and the taking of water from Michoacán to Mexico City across the immense Sistema Cutzamala that the Zapatista women of Michoacán have opposed now for many years as they attempt to get clean water, drinking water, healthy lakes that hold their water in Michoacán. It is a fight that continues to this day. This slide is from 2018. The struggle continues. I was given a paper just last week by my colleague, David Gutierrez, a paper by his colleague on El Ejército Zapatista de Mujeres Mazahuas en Defensa del Agua now, frente al fascismo social. Compare this to the water protectors against the Dakota Access Pipeline in the US, especially by the Sioux tribal nations and their allies. Compare this to the encampments and resistance at Standing Rock. Compare this to the Red Deal, indigenous action to save the earth in the United States. And think of trans-basin water transfer that robs the aquifers of the Navajo Nation and sends that water to burn coal, to move water over the mountains into the Central Arizona Water Project to feed the racial capitalist cities of the desert Southwest in the United States. Look at the work of the Black Mesa Water Coalition for Climate Justice. Look at the mural, Water Rights, in Phoenix that the Black Mesa Water Coalition and its allies, especially the kids, the teenagers of Phoenix, did on this theater that makes plain the forces, the crops, the stories, the wind turbines, the solar panels, the smoke from the smokestacks of the Navajo generating plant, a mural that collects up in a kind of string figure the work to be done. Think of the solidarity with the people of Colombia in the Asociación de Mujeres Defensoras del Agua y la Vida, who oppose the Ituanga Dam on the Cauca River and who embroider and stitch and make mochillas. Tanya Bustos gave me a mochila when I arrived at the airport in Bogota, Florecer. Florecer, to flourish, the flower, to be a uterus, to be a source of fertility, to be in alliance, to use the mochila to collect up, to gather, in Ursula Le Guin's sense, to tell the story of collecting and sharing and being in resistance and alliance together. Well, Camille too had to address not only the water transfer systems, but the avocado plantations, the wall-to-wall paving of Michoacán with avocado trees that has particularly increased since 2005 and the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the conversion of the milpa, the corn and beans, the center of kinship in the pueblos of Michoacan, into the avocado plantations, many of which are intimately tied to the financial arrangements of criminal organizations, of the drug cartels in particular, and the government of Mexico, of course, also sponsors the avocado plantations. It's entirely illegal crop, but it also is very much part of illegal logging, illegal burning to produce yet more land for avocados. It is the area where people can still get work. Perhaps it is the only work people can get. The young people can no longer, I'll tell you about that sound in a minute, the young people can no longer expect the future on their land. And the development of the Butterfly Reserve, the UNESCO site, with its divisions of nature and culture, unfortunately, probably contributes to the violence of the avocado plantation scene. But right now, I want to tell you about the export of water from Mexico to the United States in the form of avocados, particularly on what I'm calling El Día de los Muertos de Aguacates, the Super Bowl day in the United States, which is a day of eating avocados, millions and millions and millions of avocados on Super Bowl day in the United States, which is a kind of Day of the Dead, not for the connecting of the living and the dead of the generations of the return of the butterflies, but more in the sense of double death, the exporting of water in the plantations that are unsustainable, that toxify the people, the land, the animals, and that are part of what I call the time of the plantational scene, the world-making and world-destroying apparatus of the plantation that was invented in the invention of the Atlantic slave trade, the extraordinary forced deportation of peoples from these areas of Africa to innumerable sites in North, Central, and South America, and the forcing of the building of monocropping agriculture and its entire apparatus, double entry bookkeeping, the organization of labor, the organization of forced reproduction of people and of plants, the separation of nature and culture, a system of oppression and exploitation that was the model for the invention of the industrial factory a few years later, and that has been exported around the world and endures to this day in multiple systems of monocropping, including the avocado plantations of Michoacan. But the slave plantations also contained the slave gardens, these places for growing food for the people and these places of healing. Now, both of these systems have been written about particularly, and scholars who have priority in the analysis of these worlds are the African-American scholars like Monica White, Jenée Davis, Catherine McKittrick, Sylvia Winter, and others, so that my Plantationocene rests on, in, and with the work of African-American scholars to try to understand the plantation and to understand what Monica White calls freedom farmers, agricultural resistance, and the Black freedom movement. Decolonizing racial capital in the US means decolonizing the ongoing system of pandemic-friendly plantations. The food gardens, the farmers markets, the efforts to redo the relation of people and food is a very big part of this. Similarly, I draw on the work of Devon Peña and Luz Calvo. Luz Calvo was also a graduate student in my program. Devon Peña taught at the college I went to, Colorado College, and is a friend and colleague from Colorado. They and others wrote the Mexican Origin Food, Foodways, and Social Movements book. Devon Peña established, if I can find my notes, excuse me, this is worth finding, if you'll excuse me for just a minute, because I lost my way. Devon Pena also established the acequia system. He has developed programs in the upper Rio Grande bioregion for farming, for irrigation, for food justice, for teaching, for sharing, whole systems of food justice. I want to go back for just a second to the avocado plantations and tell you just a tiny bit more about the work of Colombia Gonzalez and her argument about how the ongoing separation of nature and culture in the UNESCO heritage site has removed control of the land, both from the pueblos of the ejidos and from comunitarios, from both the indigenous and campesino peoples of the area, such that they have less control over their land, such that both ritual and other practices are greatly reduced, and the power of the plantation and the authorities greatly increased. She writes about what people in the area called sad trees in the Biosphere Reserve, in the Monarch Butterfly Reserve, trees that are deprived of human care, trees where perhaps the butterflies no longer live, but which require human care in connection with the practices of agriculture and kinship, the practices of the milpa, or contemporary reinvention of the milpa, that requires the joining of the peoples, human and more than human, in the high mountains and in the lowlands to produce a robust and flourishing land. Other areas of alliance in my town, food justice in Santa Cruz, Food Not Bombs, the winter home for the Western monarch migration. This is an organization that has provided free vegetarian food for street people for many, many years. I also think of another alliance now with Altenare and Michoacan. This is an organization, an extraordinary organization that teaches building, farming, water conservation, recycling of human waste, and much more, and teaches not to, but with the people of the surrounding pueblos. Altenare is an extraordinary non-governmental organization in Michoacan committed to the ongoing worlding of the butterflies and the people and their whole world. So if you think only of the plantation or of the giant trans-basin water systems, you think only of death. But then you remember all that people are doing with other humans, with plants, with lands, with waters, with animals, with each other. And you remember the Zapatista proverb, they thought they buried us. They forgot we are seeds. Camille 5, in spite of all of the work of the first 4 Camille generations, inherited something else. The great eastern flyway of the monarchs became extinct. It died. They died. The monarchs died. The migration ended. So that Camille 5, like many, many other Sims, by the time Camille 5 is born, 2340, like many other Sims who were bonded with other endangered critters, plants and animals, inherits another task, which is to speak for the dead, to remember the symbiont in Sim animagenesis and symbiogenesis, so as to bring the dead vibrantly back into the land of the living, to stay with the trouble, so as to give heart to the living. So that by 2030, there are 1 billion human and more than human symbionts inhabiting the earth by 2425, but 2 billion humans are not Sims. They are conventional humans like me. Over 50% of all living animals in 2015, kinds of animals, are gone by 2425. This is happening now. It probably cannot be avoided. How do we live with this double death, super death, How do we become speakers for the dead in the spirit of resistance, in the spirit of that Zapatista proverb, we are seeds. Millions of kinds of critters are sims with humans. Okay, whoops, wait a minute, sorry. They thought we were dead. They forgot we are seeds. Que se muera la hidra capitalista. This is my second last slide, and it was given to me in Morelia last year by the students of Marcela Magana and David Gutierrez, and it stitches the point of my talk. It has this marvelous woman warrior. Ursula Le Guin might prefer that she had a bolsa or a mochila and not a sword, but I think of that as something that harvests food. And she does have vegetables and animals in the band around her waist. So she is killing the multi-headed Hydra capitalista. The speaker for the dead is the speaker for possible futures. Per speaks with the Catarina figure, whom I've renamed Camilla, the Catarina figure that David Gutierrez and his lover gave me in Morelia last year. She lives in my living room. She looks at the butterflies. She's unbelievably beautiful. She's definitely a skeleton. She is very Mexican. She belongs in the possible futures of the speaker for the dead, and she belongs there with Chrysalis by the painter Shoshana Dubiner, where the plants and the animals and the people of the earth are in a butterfly chrysalis that will break open and rise into the multiple worlds, the multiple living in the dead that must be kept in flourishing, that must be partially healed so that we can again have a patria compartida and not a frontera. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. That was wonderful. We're going to pass now to some questions that we have received from members of our community. I'd like to begin, if I may, with a question which is my question. It's a question for me and a question for my students as well. I want to ask you about the way that you use words like myth and mythology, because I noticed them cropping up across your works and across your books. And on the one hand, I see a relationship in the use of these words to the way that a cultural semiotician like Roland Barthes would understand myth as a particular narrative organization of signs, a kind of a worlding device. But on the other hand, I see you making very productive use of actual figures of world mythology. So I wonder if you could perhaps talk a little bit about how these concepts of myth and mythology relate to the practice of something like speculative fabulation for you.
Yes, I tend not to use the word or concept myth because of its association with the kind of semiotics of Roland Barthes and the separation of the signifier and the signified. I think of that as a binary philosophical system. That's a reductive way to put it. I prefer to speak in terms of stories and objects of different kinds. I talk a lot about storytelling and fabulation, fiction and fact, both. So I talk in terms of stories and objects in many layers of situated space and time. And I tend not to speak about mythologies so much as about stories. I speak more about stories that matter and the things, the material semiotic things that they are about. And also insofar as I draw from scholarly traditions of semiotics, and I draw from Isabelle Stengers, a French feminist philosopher of Whitehead and many other things, and also, as she does, from Charles Peirce, an American semiotician who was really very different from the French tradition associated with Roland Barthes.
Thank you. I think that's a really, really useful answer for us. Thank you very much. I've also received some questions from colleagues and students, which I'd like to ask you. And I think that I'll ask this one because I think it's related to the kind of processes you were just describing. Mariana Gaborot from Campus Monterrey, a professor here at Campus Monterrey, asks, you've always advocated for the importance of fiction, storytelling, and creativity in the generation of knowledge. But what can we do when our reality resembles a kind of gore fiction instead of science fiction? What do we do when we're faced with just what do we do when we're faced with dismembered bodies of men and women and animals? How can our imagination help us in front of this kind of violence?
That is precisely our question. First, an easy and kind of cheap reply. The important stories in the world have always been full of broken bodies, of wounded lands and waters, of dismemberment. Fiction is not about nice things. It's about the ferocity, the density of the world treated in fiction, in making stories. Now, making stories is not exactly the same thing as making them up. Okay. Storytelling can be done with facts, must be done with facts often. For example, evolutionary theory cannot be done scientifically without a storytelling process of organisms and their worlds moving through time and transforming each other. It's a storytelling practice done with facts, done with some experimental practice, done with theory, but it is also a storytelling practice. But the kind of storytelling I did with the Camille's is not scientific storytelling. It makes use of some scientific material. For example, my use of sim-animagenesis and the contemporary thinking about the holobiont and my understanding of the biological cost imposed by monocrop agriculture with heavy pesticides, so on. Lots and lots and lots of facts in my Camille stories, but they are fundamentally a fabulation. Evolutionary theory is not a fabulation, okay? But it also engages in storytelling. I think there are resonances, ties, a kind of string figuring between science fact, science fiction, speculative fabulation. I think there are knots and ties and patterns, but not identities. Okay? Now, the question of inhabiting the violence, like Nausicaa of the Valley of the Winds in Miyazaki's story, so as to come to peace, so as to be a vehicle for detoxification, partial healing, never paradise, but a kind of how to do storytelling as healing practice, not for perfection, not for the apocalypse or not for a solution, but for continuing to live and die with each other with less violence. So I think storytelling that aims for solutions, that aims to fix problems, is really part of the problem. That instead we need storytelling for staying with the trouble, for a thick now, for partial fixing and partial healing and celebrating and playing and suffering, so as to live well and die well with each other and make the present thicker. That means we cannot run from the violence. We have to learn how to live in it and with it so as to be among the healers.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that's a very helpful response, and it in some ways connects to a question that I have received from another one of our teachers here at Tech, Paco Tijerina, and he wants to know if you were aware of the way in which your work has impacted contemporary Mexican narratives and literature. Such as work by a contemporary Mexican writer, Veronica Gerber-Bisechi, who has used much of your work as an inspiration to denounce the negative impact of the extractivism that is being practiced upon Mexican land and upon the planet generally. Is this something that you were aware of, or that you know about? Because
no,
we would like you to know about it.
No, I have not known about it. And if I don't get a reference by 1 hour from now, I will be very angry at somebody. And it's one more motivation to keep learning Spanish. I have met Mexican scholars, students, thinkers, artists, storytellers, more and more over the last few years, and it has both humbled me and I think I find myself using this work. I'm pleasantly embarrassed that they might be using my work. I think, I grew up in Colorado after all. I live in California. This was Mexico not very long ago. This was Greater Mexico. The connections among us are deep and old. And of course, both Mexican and United States, said the way I just did, are the results of colonialism, Anglo and Spanish colonialism. So no surprise that we need each other to think about extractivism, to think about extinctionism, to think about the violence of the state, to think about the entanglement of the state with criminal capitalism, with racial criminal capitalism. In both cases, differently, not the same in Mexico as in the United States, but oh boy, are they linked. So I'm not surprised that when we learn of each other's work, we find that we need each other's work. So I want that reference very soon. Okay.
We'll make sure that you get it. Don't worry. We're very excited to share it with you. There's another question here, which I think would be really interesting for a lot of us. I did notice that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk about the possibility of COVID as a kind of companion species. How is it possible for us to be thinking about COVID-19 as a companion species? Because that's not as friendly as dogs for us.
Well, it depends on which dogs. First of all, companion is not a synonym for nice. It's about companus, with bread. It's about eating each other. It's about inhabiting the same bodies. And I think of the SARS-CoV-2 virus as a virus out of place that is in the human population, probably from the bat population, probably from a combination of habitat destruction and megacity urban food systems, and the failure of public health apparatuses on a global basis, beginning in China, really, and in this particular instance, the failure of communication, although they were actually successful, and never mind, that's a long story. The point is that this virus is now a companion species, like it or not. And I don't like it, but it will be with us from now on. How do we learn to live with it? How do we learn to take care of each other? How do we learn to keep from getting sick? How do we learn to make vaccines that will put in a context of vaccine justice across the world and not just in the rich places? How do we live with this virus, rebalance our relationships with this virus? We will not make this virus extinct, even if we want to. Making our enemies extinct is not a route to peace. Learning to live with is quite another matter. The number of organisms that industrial capitalist human beings attempt to kill, to make extinct, instead of learning to live with better, is endless. That list is a problem. That learning to live in complexity, which is not sorting bad virus, good human, bad disease, good, that's the virus is a companion species. Companion species are about inhabiting the same body.
Thank you very much. I think that's very useful for a lot of us. And I think that this idea of inhabiting the same space and the same body is related in some ways to a number of questions that came from a few people related to the practice of situating knowledge. I asked these questions of you, but I think that they're questions that are frequent because they are questions that perturb many of us who know that we are occupying spaces of enormous academic and social privilege. So we see ourselves implicated in these questions. But we wanted to ask for you, how do you, here particularly Margot Etchenberg, one of our teachers from Camposillo de Mexico, asks, how do you reconcile the importance of acting and thinking locally with transnational feminism? And I think this, I'm going to ask a sort of a double question, if that's okay, because it connects very closely to a question that Sonia Cejudo has asked about, in particular, how do you navigate the potential for academic colonialism that's always this kind of dangerous presence and invitations to do keynote conferences such as this one, that's even present in a resignification practice, right? Like taking the Caterina and associating it with the Camila. You know, how do you hope to navigate those dangers? I know that's kind of a big question.
It's something I think that I and we think about a lot, never well enough. There were several instances of very non-innocent resignification and even appropriation in the talk I just gave. I'll name a couple of them to address the question. First, situated knowledge is about taking seriously one's own situatedness, not so as to produce it as this weird, super privilege. Situated knowledge really means taking seriously the limits, the skills, the access, the obligations. What kind of responsibility does a person have because of a certain pathway through life and certain locations? Being in the university with its resources is also about tying the university and its resources to people and communities who can use them. And not necessarily from above, but a kind of figuring out less hierarchical ways of doing that. And there are two instances of international feminism and appropriation, two things I want to talk about. Everybody is somewhere, no one is everywhere. Everyone is somewhere, no one is everywhere. There is no such thing as even though I used the word, there's no such thing as international feminism as such. There are feminists in many times and places and situations, partially linked to each other, sometimes even in international organizations, often through exchanges of knowledges, stories, people, objects, travel. International feminism is a string figure composed of situated people who are confronting the unacceptable situation of women and children and women, the people of women and their people, human and non-human, on this earth. Okay, it centers the very problematic category women, a category that falls apart the minute you touch it. It's an impossible category. Those are the best kind. Feminism is a string figure of commitment, and it breaks. Everybody, certainly I, fail repeatedly, but it is in the breakdown. The phenomenologists taught us it is in the breakdown that people have a chance to learn how to fix, to rebuild, to do something else. So that's appropriate. I want to say a little bit more about appropriation. The Caterina figure renamed Camilla is partly a joke, but it's not an innocent joke because she is a Caterina figure. Just because she lives in Santa Cruz now doesn't make her Camilla. On the other hand, Caterina changed Camille's mind about a lot of things, and Caterina is Camille's teacher. So maybe it's not okay to rename her or to use her as a folk art object in my living room. But then what? She's a gift. She has become somebody. She's not just a thing. She somehow, the fact that this figure is in my life has changed what I am responsible to. It has changed the way I need to make myself response able. It has changed my obligations, my responsibilities toward an area of the world that 10 years ago I knew nothing about. In this case, the transvolcanic belt of Mexico, the linkages between the areas of trans-basin water transfer that I knew from my own previous scholarship and life history. There are now linkages. And Caterina is a figure that calls me to account for that. But it's still appropriation, and it's still resignification that is not innocent. And I can well understand part of myself and somebody else who would get rather angry about that. Anger's okay. It's one of the emotions of string figuring. It's one of the important forces for trying to understand how to work with each other. The other moment of appropriation in this talk was around the plantation. It was my decision to continue using the word plantationocene, which I and a group of colleagues invented, proposed a few years ago in a discussion about mainly the oil palm and rubber tree plantations and other monocrop tree plantations in various parts of the world, in particular Southeast Asia, but other plantations too, and trying to understand the last 500 years as the repeated deployment, spreading and modifying and reinventing and making of the plantation as world making. So it is not the Anthropocene, the time of human being making the world, or even Capitalocene, both those things, but Plantationocene. Plantation is really key. But in that conversation, I and we did not cite Monica White or Catherine McKittrick or Sylvia Wynter or many others. We alluded to the African slave trade and the plantations, the sugar plantations and the slave gardens and so on, but we concentrated on something else and proposed a word. It's a word that got taken up by a lot of people and intended to displace the prior and better and deeper scholarship of many African-American scholars. Well, that's not okay. Why do I still use the word? Two reasons. One, to signify that I think the controversy is actually rather important and that we are in this together, and that the multi-species commitments of the way I use the word plantationocene are not only compatible with, they are in strong alliance with the food justice work of African-American and other scholars and activists, certainly the work of Devon Pena, but many others in the Southwest, that the question that is badly named by a Western word, multi-species, an Anglo word made vaguely Spanish, okay, that multi-species is a difficult word, is a controversial word for many people involved in environmental justice, because it seems to displace the human in favor of non-human beings, including like bacteria or viruses. Okay, how to truly engage in this work without doing that, without those displacements, how to build these alliances and to make forceful that I and people like me are working in human and non-human worldings together and against binaries and in alliance with the scholarship and activism of people who are situated differently, but I think in connection. So I tend not to run away from the controversial words, but to try to stay with the anger or the trouble or the difficulty of doing these necessary things for which none of us has a full answer.
So much. I think that that's a real privilege to hear you think through these ideas for us. And it really helps us to think about how we confront these troubling problems. We just have time for one more question. I think, again, it's very much related to the things that you talked about, but I want to kind of pull it out of your talk because I think it's particularly important to us to hear about this idea of double death. And I would like if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean by double death, and also about the role of the speakers for the dead. I find it very, very difficult to read about the speakers for the dead without thinking of all the work that's done and has been done over the decades by Latin American political activists who have attempted to not allow genocides to be silenced and to re-presence the dead, keep them present, generate methodologies for active memory. And I see that in this idea of the speakers of the dead, there's a kind of a reorientation of those practices towards other species. So I wonder if you could maybe, if you speak about a little bit about that connection that might exist between certain very important and deeply felt Latin American political practice that, yes, are very much focused on human beings, and the role of speakers for the dead, and then this concept of double death, which I think is really important for us to understand.
Yeah, let me speak to double death first. It's a concept taught to me by the anthropologist who worked in Australia for most of her life, named Deborah Bird Rose. She learned from people in the Aboriginal peoples in Arnhem Land, who she writes of as her teachers, about time, about a responsible person in country faces those who came before, does not face the future, faces those who came before, so as to leave to those who come after cared for country. So you face those who came before, both the immediately before, you can still remember by name maybe for 100 years, but the generations and generations before, human and more than human. More than human is a term that comes to us from Australian feminism, interestingly. The more than human, instructed by Aboriginal thinking. The more than human, the responsible person faces those who come before so as to leave to those who come after less ruined country. And those who cannot, if you cannot do that, it is normal for plants and animals and human beings and even stories to die. It is not normal to kill the processes of ongoingness, to kill the possibility of going on. That killing of the possibility of going on is truly poisoned story, poisoned land, poisoned water. It's not just dying, which is not just normal, but about living and dying together are what are. Living and dying together is what is. The kind of dying that is the killing of the possibility of ongoing is what Deborah Bird Rose called double death. So that extractionism, agriculture as extraction, agriculture as mining, the kind of agriculture that depletes the aquifers, robs the lakes, drains the creeks, kills the towns, expels the youth, poisons the land, makes crops that make people sick. That is the practice of double death for profit. Okay, that is the practice that the Camille's and many others must speak against and work against, must live with. Now, it is true in a major way that Latin American writers, storytellers, both in fiction and in essay, and both in fiction and poetry and scholarly work and so on, that Latin American thinkers, writers, and activists have been involved in the nurturing of active memory, the nurturing of memory, not as a melancholic practice, but as a practice of mourning for living, as a practice of bringing forward, not as victim, but as presence. And that it's extremely difficult. Certainly the long history of the disappeared in Argentina is a piece of this. I'm a little bit aware of some of it. There is a great deal of work I do not know and should know, maybe will know a little better than I do now. But that practice of speaking for the dead and bringing forward mourning that remembers, so as to open up ongoingness, so as not to practice what Deborah Bird Rose called double death, is something Camille too and on learned. Okay. Now, the humanism of it all. If you say I am not humanist, that does not mean I am anti-human. It means human with humans and more than humans together, that there is no living that is not always already together, that humans are always already with the other beings of the world. That is what makes us human. So that human exceptionalism that foregrounds the human as if it were a bounded and isolated category in culture over and against everything else, which is nature, that I am against. Human beings are another matter altogether. A multi-species humanism, or multi-species is really a terrible word, because the word species itself is just as bad as individual. And multi is just multiplying, some kind of robust, this is why I turn to writers like Zoe Todd and her Métis storytelling. This is why I read a great deal of indigenous literature, really, that takes for granted the already entangled human and more than human worlding, and does not start from the premise of an independent humanism, quite the opposite. And that the nurturing of people, human people, as well as the nurturing of more than human people, requires a consciousness of and an ongoing nurturing of these connections, including the connections of the living and the dead.
Thank you so much, Donna. I'm afraid that we don't have time for any more questions, but you've been so generous with your time and with your answers today. And I have to say that I think it's been so useful for us who've been reading and studying your work, and a wonderful foundation for us to go forward and start developing our own words and our own concepts and our own tools for talking about these, I'm going to say multi-species worldings. You know, we just need more words. So we've got to start making them. Thank you so much for all of your time today and all of your answers.
And you realize my solution to the problem of words is to multiply them rather than subtract them.